Lejla, please tell my story. I met my boyfriend when I was 31. I was a single mother of two young boys studying to be a nurse at university at the time. And looking back now, I can easily identify the vulnerabilities that I had in regards to my own self-worth and my self-esteem. I wasn't instantly attracted to him, but he was very charismatic, and eventually I found myself growing fond of him. After a few weeks of dating, he began to tell me how he was madly in love with me. I found this strange to begin with, but the more you hear it, the more you believe it, and I started to mimic his declaration of love. After a month, he told me that he was due in court and could possibly be going to prison. He asked me to stay with him whilst he was inside, and I naively agreed. I definitely minimised the charges that he was up against. He would often call me from prison and let out awful rages. He'd say that his ex, the mother of his child, was making his life hell and that it was somehow my fault and he'd blame me for it. He managed to gain my sympathy quite early on by manipulating me into believing that she was just his bitter ex. I know now that she was also a victim of domestic abuse at his hands. Before he went to prison, I began to notice that he was short-tempered, but I just put this down to stress. He was expressing strong signs of jealousy, telling me that he hated the thought of another man touching me before we'd even met, and even changed my Facebook relationship status to engaged as a joke and refused to give my phone back. I eventually closed my Facebook account permanently a couple of years into our relationship because simply having social media was just causing too many rows. The physical abuse began 18 months into our relationship. A strike on my arm was just a mere taste of what was to transpire. My abuser was capable of so much more. I spent almost 5 years with him, enduring psychological, emotional, and physical abuse. Unless you encounter this experience yourself, it's difficult to believe that this type of monster exists. It's clear that elements of mental abuse and manipulation were present from day one. It followed a textbook pattern. In reflection, my good nature, albeit sheer naivety, allowed me to offer him the benefit of the doubt. I would often excuse his outbursts of verbal aggression and rage. The first assault occurred after I witnessed him driving another woman around in his car. On questioning him about it, he responded with insults before grabbing my arm and striking me so hard my car keys flew out my hand and into a bush. Inside, I knew that this was a warning sign, and the abuse continued. And shortly after this incident, I broke off the relationship. But it wasn't for long. The split only lasted 1 month until I succumbed to his perpetual pleas for forgiveness. Inevitably, though, the cycle of abuse worsened after it. Love bombing switched to continual mental and physical abuse. Like clockwork, every month, this pattern would repeat itself. He became obsessed over certain things, mainly me with other men. He was often predictable, but sometimes not. I walked on eggshells around him just to pacify him and prevent situations from rising. I soon learnt not to talk back too. On the rare occasion that I did, it sent him into a violent rage. I cannot count the amount of times that he'd thrown his weight around, aggressively grabbed my arms and legs, and left me marked, bleeding, and bruised. He'd pull me to the ground by my hair and throw objects at me from afar. The times that he pushed me and shoved me into walls, pinned me down and grabbed me by my throat. And during verbal rages, all kinds of awful names were hurled at me. He would criticise my entire being. He'd call me manipulative and tell me that other people had awful things to say about me too, and that I was mentally unwell. The continual change in his temperament left my mind in a constant state of confusion. Being adored and admired filled my heart. Being despised and disgusted broke my soul. I was his world. He couldn't live without me, but he could still scream obscenities at me and leave me for days on end, punishing me with his silent treatment. His words and actions never aligned, but I was so heavily distressed every day that I just couldn't see through the fog. He showed me no mercy during my pregnancies either, and the first one ended in a miscarriage. The baby had stopped growing around 6 weeks when he'd pulled me to the floor by my hair, causing clumps of it to fall out. Then he strangled me, and when I pleaded for him that I was pregnant with his child, he just stormed out. I tried to stop him, but he punched me in the arm. In the later stages of our relationship, he became very sadistic with his accusations. He would scream at me and that I was the one that aborted his baby. The miscarriage was so traumatic for me, and I could tell that he enjoyed hurting me with his words. My second pregnancy with our son was pretty much the same, attack after attack. He threw a glass vase at me once as I was running down the stairs away from him, then he pinned me to the ground and throttled me. The entire pregnancy was just darkened by a daily dose of mental abuse. I felt so drained and unsupported, I cried every single day. And so the violence continued to spiral after our son was born. He was careless, but I still carried guilt and shame at what my baby witnessed and heard. I recall the time that he spat at me through the kitchen window whilst I held our newborn in my arms. He had just attempted to enter the home by kicking in the front door. My mum begged me not to be with him whilst trying to climb through the kitchen window, damaging the outside property in the process, as she had done so on many other occasions, but I would minimise the experiences. I often lied to her that I had ended the relationship just to pacify her. After every single act of violence and rage, the love bombing campaign would recommence. No one would ever love me the way that he did. I was the prettiest woman that he'd ever been with, and that if I ended things, his life would be pointless. And suicide threats became a regular theme of emotional abuse. When my son was 5 weeks old, he kicked off in our home, and at 5 a.m. he threatened suicide and left. Frantically, I was repeatedly calling his phone, and when he finally answered, he refused to reveal where he was. I was in a state of hysteria. I spent hours not knowing if he was dead or alive. The smear campaigns that he'd carry out against me were relentless. He imputed dishonesty, slandered my name, manipulated others' perception of me, giving the impression that I was insane. He made ludicrous claims about me, and even though I know that they were lies, I feared that other people might believe him. People warned me of his senseless ramblings, but his denial game was so strong. I would believe him, and he would convince me that the behaviour was my fault, and I would question my own sanity. A shift in my personality and behaviour caused my friends to become increasingly concerned for my welfare. I was a shadow of my former self, a nervous wreck, constantly preoccupied with forever trying to please him. I'd lost all sense of myself and I felt empty inside. When presented with concrete evidence of his wrongdoings to me, including affairs with other women, he would manipulate me and give me ultimatums, making me choose between him and my friends. He would stop my communication with those who were against him. He even attempted to turn my own mother against me when she confronted him about his assaults. She warned him that she would contact the police, and she was in constant fear that one day he was going to kill me. He was calculated and cruel. He would often gaslight me by making me doubt my own thoughts and feelings. When I had a gut feeling, I'd express it to him. He would say, "You're not right in the head." On some occasions, he'd almost force me to admit that I had not done things, and I started to doubt my own actions and memories. Friends would advise me to ignore the claim, but if I had done so and not protested my innocence to him, that would only mean that he was right and I just didn't care about him. And I knew from many experiences that this would aggravate him even further. I started experiencing panic attacks over his constant cheating accusations towards me. And no matter how much I declared my innocence to him, he just kept on torturing me mentally. And he would just become more enraged because I couldn't admit to something that I just didn't do. On one occasion, he was driving around at an insanely high speed for 30 minutes. I feared for my life, so I briefly recorded him in secret on my phone. He punched me in the stomach at the start of the journey to assert his control and fear over me. On pleading for him to stop and let me out, crying that my children would lose their mother if he were to crash, he simply just shrugged his shoulders and shouted out that he didn't care. And when the journey ended, he leaned into me, kissed my forehead and said, "You know I love you, babe." He would often track my location in a bid to catch me out because he was convinced that I was meeting men late at night. And there were many occasions that he attempted to hack mine and my friends' social media accounts. If anyone else shared a photo with me in it or changed their display picture that included me, it would cause him to verbally abuse me before blocking me and refusing to speak to me until I made them delete it completely. Ironically, I was actually never allowed to be seen on his social media though. Once, he grabbed me into a chokehold because I rolled my eyes when he mentioned yet another man's name. Our son was sitting in the nearby high chair at the time, and he witnessed his mother being attacked, and I can still remember the fear on his face. A similar attack occurred again just 1 week after, when he cornered me in the kitchen in the exact same spot. I was crying out of fear, but he said that I was crying because another man must have upset me. He agreed to let me pass if I admitted it, and claimed that he just wanted to help me. In pure fear, I grabbed a small knife and he just laughed at me and said that I wouldn't stab him with it. I replied, "Of course not, but I know that you won't hurt me whilst this is in my hand." He continued to press for more information about the guy that just didn't exist. Whilst tears streamed from my face, I feared another chokehold, and I went totally numb. He eventually stepped aside and freed me from the situation, and within minutes he was hugging me and said, "Let's just forget about this guy and have a nice evening together." I complied for the sake of peace, but this was the beginning of the turning point where I realised that I had begun to hate him. And although I knew the relationship must end, I was heavily trauma bonded. He'd interrogated me after a night out once, and I listed every place that I'd been to that night, all but one. The following month, he somehow learned this, and it caused him to lose his temper. He screamed in my face that 36-year-old mothers don't enter clubs like that. Dickhead. He once again demanded that I list every place I visited with my friends, not allowing me the chance to answer though, as he grabbed my jaw and squeezed it tightly, and I couldn't breathe, let alone speak. He proceeded by smashing my head into the wall repeatedly, before backhanding me across the mouth. He then stormed off in a rage without an apology, showing no remorse. I called him as he drove off, telling him that my mouth was bleeding and I had marks all over my face. He just screamed at me repeatedly, telling me that I was a whore. The psychological and emotional abuse that I received from him once when we were on a trip away together was relentless. At my wit's end, I told him that I wanted to leave. As usual, violence was his response. He grabbed and twisted my arm to the point where I thought it was going to snap, and he spat in my face whilst taunting me with vile words. I stood holding my son and I sobbed as he casually walked off with his friends, joking and laughing on the way. He kicked off later again that night and then again the next morning. It was just unbearable. I drove us home in floods of tears. Whilst on the way home, I voiced my desire to end the relationship, and he consequently jumped out of the moving car. It was horrific. No sooner had we arrived home, he attacked me again. He grabbed me at my throat before pushing me away and threw a nearby object at me. This time, I took the chance to escape. I left the house and I locked myself in the car and I waited for him to leave. And it was the last time that I ever saw him. At rock bottom, I finally reported everything to the police and an injunction was put in place. I disclosed and detailed all the horrors that I had endured. Alongside my statement, I submitted all of my photographic evidence and I counted 17 assaults and an immeasurable amount of mental abuse. One of the officers even commented that this was one of the worst cases he'd come across. The case was immediately referred to CID as my abuser was already on record for previous domestic abuse against other women. I learned that the CPS could only charge him for common assaults that had occurred within 6 months, and therefore he was charged and found guilty of only 2 accounts of assault by beating. He was sentenced to community service and received a fine. I then went on to find out that he'd done this to his ex-partner too. I discovered that he had abused her mentally and physically and played us off against each other. Through the trauma we shared, we've been able to become a support network for each other, and our sons now share a special bond. I'm now living free from abuse. I am single and I've chosen to stay this way whilst I heal. I'm raising my sons in a happy and carefree environment, and they no longer have to watch their mum be distressed and crying every day. So please, ladies, don't ignore red flags. Please get help and get out. Please don't stay stuck in an abusive relationship like I did.